Omer, ready?
I am ready.
Opa, and action, 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 action. Welcome to DevOps Topics.
Oh, I missed the props
Ooh-ah,
again. Fuck. Can I say
ooh-ah,
fuck? I
Omer,
can't say
it's,
fuck. Oh my god.
don't say it. It's episode number 19th.
19. 19. Yes.
Ooh-ah, that's, every week it's like, wow, we've come this far. Okay, so this week we are going to talk about topic of the week is with the effects. IAM,
I
which
am.
stands for Identity
Identity and
Access.
access management.
Exactly,
To anyone listening,
exactly.
we did not practice that. Not even
No,
once.
no, and we
Yeah.
are coordinated.
Uh-huh.
So this is today's topic, this week's topic, this episode's topic. And Omer, the first question, as always,
What is it going to be? Hmm.
what's the first thing that comes up to your mind when I say IAM?
The most dangerous place on AWS by I can't say fuck, so not fucking far, by far. Most
Mm-hmm.
dangerous place on AWS, and I'm not saying that because that's the I don't know easiest place to hack into or whatever. But maybe it is.
Sounds
Uh,
like it.
yeah, sounds like it, but I think that is the most. That's the place with the most issues that are relating to security. That's the most I think issues you have when you start to uh, work with SOC 2, things like that. Start to work with all kinds of certificates you're trying to pass in the organization. And basically, the place I can't say focus most of my time on, but I focus a lot on of effort of keeping it tidy and clean. I'll just say two more sentences because that's a lot for just one question. But it's the place where I manage profiles for users, where I manage roles for machines, instances, stuff like that. It's the place where you I don't know, distribute credentials from also to users, machine, etc., etc. It's a place where you manage things like least privilege access when you try to prevent people from doing things they shouldn't, either users or machines, things like that. And I started with talking about security because that's essentially where you can gain access into an AWS account. You can perform things like privilege escalation, which means I can take one role maybe that I managed to hack into an instance and then use that role to do certain stuff. Maybe that role doesn't have all the permission to do certain things that I'm looking to do. For example, delete an EC2, delete an ECS cluster, but maybe I can assume a role. And that happens many times. Maybe assume a role, that's a specific action that I can do on AWS. And that means that with a specific set of credentials, I can take on myself another role and then use new credentials. And from there, I can move laterally within the organization or upscale my own credentials and do certain stuff. It's it's a lot.
It's a big topic.
It's a big topic. Yes.
Okay. I want to divide it. Now I feel I have the need to divide it. So as a beginner, I think I remember myself as a beginner when I first started handling IAM. I think the greatest issue that I had was realizing which is which. So let's say I have my application, and we'll talk about maybe two types of application. The one that you are super familiar and is your daily basis, like Zesti's application, okay, like an application of a cloud that works with a cloud provider. And
Yep.
maybe my application is some, I don't know, some static website that takes information about soccer results and
Mm-hmm.
has nothing to do with the cloud, okay? So two different applications. One doesn't deal with AWS credentials or AWS at all, or any cloud provider, and the other one, I don't know, is like Zesty, as I said,
Mm-hmm.
provides some cloud
Mm-hmm.
services. So I think most of the users, just assuming most of the listeners' users, are those who are developing, regular applications, not related to AWS, any kind of
Yeah.
applications.
Yeah.
And then the IAM is a bit confusing because you have credentials for AWS and then you have permissions in your application.
Right.
So I think that as a beginner, I want us to make this like clear cut where my application stops and where IAM and AWS begins, when it comes to roles and credentials, right? So I say let's do it like that. I'll say the app and you say AWS. Okay, so I'll start with the app. If you want to have roles and permissions and login, okay, users and base users, like roles for your application. So let's say your application has view mode, edit mode, administrator, power user, or anything like to your application, to your soccer API, football API application, whatever. You need to create your own user base, maybe with some identity cloud provider like Okta or maybe AWS Cognito to, I don't know, manage the user pool, right? This is for your application and the roles that user actually do with the browser or maybe API calls to your application. And then, putting that aside, what is IAM, Omer? So this is my roles and permissions for my application. So where does the IAM comes into the applications, or maybe it's not even related to that?
So you added a different layer or aspect to the topic, which I didn't even think about, and it's totally relevant, which is how I manage identity and access management for applications. Maybe I don't care about the permissions for AWS. I don't care about being able to query an S3 bucket. I do very much care about how my users are authenticating with the system and what they get to do within the system. So to be honest, I didn't have anything about that in mind. Yes, you can use services like Auth0 and Cognito was it within AWS. You asked a few things about IAM, and when I speak about IAM specifically here, and now I'm talking about AWS IAM, which is the identity and access management of
and this
users.
is what we'll focus. We will focus on that. Just saying, some listeners are like, well, what's the difference? I mean, I have my roles and the AWS roles. How do I separate this?
Perfect. So I think we can focus on first explaining what AWS IAM is, which I did start to do, and then everything that's not that and is related to your application isn't part of this. When you manage things within your application, yes, you can use AWS services like we've mentioned. Don't know what the vast majority of users are doing, but we're speaking about solely the access of developers and applications or resources that are running in the cloud to do stuff in the cloud. Again, like if I have a process that runs within an EC2 server and I need to query an S3 bucket, or maybe I'm using some kind of queue that's actually an SQS queue, that's a service by AWS, I need to read stuff from that. In order to read stuff from an AWS resource, I need to have...
So your application needs to do that, for example.
Exactly. And okay, that's a good point. My user accessed my application. Now the application needs to do something to provide service for that user. Maybe that user needs to read something, data from my application, and that's stored in S3 within a bucket. That bucket is private. The only entity that has access to that bucket would be the EC2 server that has a role. In the past, I think roles were not that known about or used, and we used a set of credentials. We just created another duplication of credentials as in a user in the cloud, and we provided that. You can, of course, do that. An AWS, what do they call? Access key ID, and then a secret access key. Once you have a set of these, you can use that within an application. Many problems to that. First, it's not rotating. If you don't do that manually, they don't rotate. It's not temporary, it's constant. Another problem, obviously, if you're using it in one place, it can leak to another place. So again, the temporary issue thing. And for that, you have roles. Roles are kind of those profiles that you attach to a certain resource, be that a container, a cluster, a node, an EC2 instance. And then once I have that role, I don't have to use a set of credentials because by definition, when I have a role, I can access things on AWS. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let's talk about a full flow. I think we talked about a lot of theory. I say let's talk a flow. Okay, let's take your example.
Mm-hmm.
We have an application. This application stores files, for example, public files, private files.
Mm-hmm.
And I want my user, when they go to my website, omer.com, they enter, and now they want to enter to omer.com/private. Once they are there, they need to get a static file in front of their face.
Mm-hmm.
I love to manage static files in S3, okay, in Amazon's storage service. So what's the flow from the moment the user sends the application, or maybe even logs in to the application, to the moment they get a response from AWS? And let's leave out all the DNS query, just talking about the credentials.
It's a good interview question.
Yeah, something like that,
Okay, so let's not go too deep into the application logic because it can be
Yeah.
developed in many ways, but basically, right, the basic stuff. So, like you said, a user reaches out to the application wherever it's coming through. Yes, DNS routed through some kind of a load balancer, hopefully, then reaches the backend. I don't know where your authentication mechanism sits. It can sit on top before the load balancer. It can, and then you authenticate with a service like Okta, Auth0, etc., or Cognito by AWS, or maybe
So
that's
now I'm authenticated, and I also, like, the user also has a bearer token with the proper authorization, right?
right. So that would usually sit in a cookie within your
Yeah.
browser, and then my backend gets the cookie, probably reads it with the key, understand that this user is valid because the cookie is valid, he's authenticated. And then maybe I manage different sets of permissions within my application. Maybe that user is an admin, a normal user, an organization manager, whatever. That's an application logic that I don't manage as the one that develops infrastructure in AWS. That's for the developer to set. But this user has a certain set of permissions within the application, and then the application makes the logic within it to decide whether that user can access the data or not. Assuming it can, now my application needs to reach somewhere and grab that information. I think 9 out of 10 times that would be a database. The database, by the way, can be a service on AWS. For example, if I'm using DynamoDB as my database, that would be a service. You can only access that through API calls that you do with a set of permissions. And now, again, regardless whether that would be Dynamo or S3 and just reading a text file, I need to do that with a set of permissions. And usually, hopefully, those set of permissions would be the role that's attached to me. Me can be a pod on EKS. It can be an ECS role. It can be an EC2 instance profile, which is just another type of role that's attached to the machine. And then I grab the file, I send it back, the user gets it.
Okay,
Yeah?
I like
Okay.
it. Let's
Okay.
dive even deeper.
Okay.
Now, yeah, so that was the basics. That was like the very high and middle level, I'd say. Let's dive into the ugly stuff, all right? When I say ugly, I mean like web identity token, like when you're doing Kubernetes, all that. I think it's going to be cool to say a few words about that. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure, then maybe you go ahead.
Okay, so for example, in Kubernetes, so you said the user is authenticated, authorized, maybe it's admin, maybe it's a viewer, whatever. Now it reaches the backend. So maybe if the backend is a container in Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes cluster, which sits in AWS, AWS EKS, whatever. No matter how you manage your Kubernetes cluster, you can use IAM role and attach it to the container. So the container assumes that role with the web identity token. You know, that's a assume role in Kubernetes.
Yep.
Right, which is cool. So the application itself goes and searches the environment variable AWS web identity token. It has a specific path that is mounted to the container. This path contains the temporary credentials that the application can use to assume a role in AWS and maybe fetch a file from S3, maybe get something from DynamoDB, whatever, according to the role. Now I'm thinking out loud, Omer. I talked about two different types of roles, and I hope I'm not, land mining myself. Let's say I have an admin user and a viewer, two sets of permissions. One is view only, and the other is view and edit, right? My application obviously can do everything, view, edit, read, delete, whatever. So how do you, like when you have a set of user permissions, so this is going to be like the connection between user permissions to AWS permissions, if you think about it, because I want admin users only to be able to view and edit, and maybe to viewers to only to view. So it's two different roles. So I don't think I'm going to hold two different containers, so each container has different permissions. So do you have any idea how to attack this specific thing?
I don't have any other idea but to stop it on the application level. I would stop it there because I would usually, for example, Nest, which you've used. Nest provides that functionality exactly. It lets you set different set of roles, not permissions, but roles within the application. And then based on that role, you can then decide within the application logic whether this user can do something or can't. For example, he's an admin, he's a manager, he's a user, he's a privileged user. And then based on a set of roles that I've defined within the application, I can then I'm the backend, and I now makes the decision whether this user can read a certain type of information. For example, information about the organization that I'm part of. For example, certain data that may be stored somewhere else on S3 Dynamo like we talked before, but that would be within the application. And then assuming that any type of user would access this resource, like you said, we won't use two different or a set of resources for different type of worlds. This certain resource, has the entire set of permissions that it would ever need to perform any kind of task. And then the blockage would be within the application logic.
You have no idea how interesting it is what you just said, because I think it's like it's very. I'm a bit surprised because on one hand, we always like to say least privilege and don't let something access if it's not meant to be, right? If it's not meant to. On the other hand, you're saying the obvious, I think, that my application has to have all the access it needs to perform update, delete, whatever. I'm not going to create instances of my application according to permissions. That would be crazy. So a single container can do anything, but you're saying I'm going to block the API access to AWS maybe according to that. It still sounds like a security risk. I don't know why, right? Because the application can do everything. And then...
Okay, right. So we're getting into application security, but yes, basically this, what you're saying here is I'm assuming my application is going to be hacked, and now I want to stop it on the next level, which is an AWS type of access. And for that, you can do certain things and add layers of security. But what I want to say here, if you don't trust your application security, what you need to fix is your application security rather than the mechanisms on top of that. That said, there are additional solutions. You can, for example, you mentioned something within an EKS cluster. We talked about temporary credentials, so let me branch out from this conversation to there. What I wanted to say is you can put something like a Vault server within the EKS cluster. And then once I have a Vault service, I can talk to the Vault service to obtain a set of credentials for AWS. The nice thing about it, that Vault's in the backend, it's in its own backend, has a set of permissions or a role that it can communicate with AWS IAM and provision with using a service that's called STS, a simple token service, I think, on AWS. And with that,
something like that.
So you provide a temporary token and with a temporary set of credentials. So you would have the same AWS access key ID, you would have the same AWS secret access key, and you would now have a third additional string that would be AWS session ID or something. It's a session, basically.
Session token, I think back in the days it was security token. Remember, I think they changed it.
Something like that. Anyway, that would define whether the set of credentials is valid, and valid is not only whether it's correct, it's also whether the time period that was extended to it is still relevant. So I can generate a token, for example, with Vault for an hour. You can. But
Omer, wait, what is Vault? Yeah. You say Vault. What is Vault?
Okay, Vault is a secret management by HashiCorp. The normal usage or the standard usage for it is to store secret data, and then applications that need secret data, for example, passwords for databases, and create a certain set of credentials regardless whether that AWS or anything else, you can store there, and then when an application needs it, it communicates with Vault based on a token or the IAM role that's attached to that certain entity, and then Vault decides, is it relevant or not? Is it valid or not? Can this role read what it's asking? For example, is it actually running on production environment, and is it this type of application, and does this type of application can read the data that it's asking for? And if it is, I can unlock the data, decrypt it, or send it back and it will be decrypted. That's Vault. What I did want to say, I want to take it to the temporary access that you mentioned. So we talked about having a temporary access for applications. The same thing exactly can be done for users. Yes, you can have the user communicate with Vault every time they want to access AWS. There's a better solution. AWS provisioned or...
It sounds like a pre-sale what you said.
Exactly.
You have a better solution.
Yeah. I know something you don't.
Yeah.
So AWS, they're kind of encouraging it too, to migrate users from standalone users within AWS IAM to what they now call the IAM Management Center, or whatever it's used to be called, SSO. Essentially, what this means is that instead of managing certain users and their credentials, like specifically manually, standalone as a user, You now migrate them into SSO. You can provision them manually, but SSO is easily integratable with Active Directory or Google Directory or Okta, any kind of service that manages users. And then once that's managed and sync, you can configure different set of groups and users. And when a user is logging in through SSO to AWS, they get a temporary set of credentials. So they have this nice
wait,
dashboard.
just to focus, when you say SSO, it's for now, we moved away from the application for, I'd say, customers, okay? And now we're talking about SSO
users.
of internal, like users,
the developers in the company.
Okay, so this is for internal services, SSO for internal services.
Yeah.
All right.
Internal users. And when a user wants to access something, the reason a user would want to access something is, for example, to read this data from S3 or to upload something from S3 from his computer. Hopefully, it's not to do stuff in production other than read them, but yes, you do need to interact.
Product team wants to download S3 artifacts that the development team has uploaded from a CI/CD process.
Not only that, maybe I want to access the console and start a new EC2 server to test something or to do something. I need to have permissions for that. So when you log into the EC2 dashboard, based on who you are as a user, you authenticated in some kind of way. Google, Okta, Auth0, wherever. You're now authenticated and you have a certain set of permissions that was configured on SSO. And then you have two things you can do. With this set of credentials, you can log into the console and do stuff, or you can obtain those three sets of permission credentials that we discussed. You can copy paste them, use them within your console, within your application, and run them. And you can configure for how long can they be provisioned for, between something 1 hour and 12 hours, I think it's the max.
Yeah.
And then once you work like that, there's no longer the problem or the issue of credentials that were provisioned 2 years ago and nobody knows where they've leaked. And you only stop at 12 hours. So it's constantly rotating. And then you upgrade your security.
Yeah. I also add that because you use the SSO, so if someone, let's say we use Google, the Google Suite. Mm-hmm. So if someone leaves the Google Workspace, so if someone leaves the organization and they try to log into AWS, they are redirected to Google. But if the user can't log into Google because they left the company, so they got deactivated, then they don't have access to AWS.
Exactly.
Again, talking about internal users, all right? It's important to separate because we talked a lot in the beginning about application and whatever. Right. Now we're talking about developers, QA, products, DevOps, anyone in the organization that wants to access AWS. This is the talk now, okay?
Yeah. And one more thing about that, by the way, I think we talked about it a few times, but specifically because you mentioned Google Directory, which is what I'm working with. If you want to keep the two in sync, AWS have their own tool that's called SSO Sync, if I'm not mistaken. We'll leave the link below. And it's essentially a tool that you probably want to run within a Lambda function or periodically from wherever. And it syncs between your Google Directory with a set of credentials by Google and then with AWS SSO. And it actually can sync the groups from Google to the groups on SSO. So you can decide, I don't know, a user has joined the company, you automatically put them under R&D@company.com. And now you know that all the R&D can have read permissions on staging environment. So he automatically obtains that set of permissions and there's no need for you to do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yes. And also adding that SSO is a big solution, okay? So if you're a startup, let's say up to 10 people, you'll probably will create users manually in IAM, and you might even give them all, yes, it might sound weird, administrator access. Okay, so Omer, let's talk about that. I'm more inclined over, let's not have, something that delays us, such as permissions. So if that's something that delays my work, I'd rather give administrator access to someone, well, not to anyone, but I'm more inclined to that than starting to pick each permission, each policy for everything because it delays my work, okay? And again, as a small startup, not when I need to meet with compliance and everything, okay? So what do you have to say about this topic, about permissions and, delaying work because I don't have permission?
Okay, first of all, there are paid solutions. I can think of 2 Israeli companies. I don't want to plug them here. If you Google good enough, you'll find them. That said, you're speaking about a company with 10 people. I'm not sure they have the finance, they don't have the money to pay for that kind of a service. I tend to agree with you. I've learned in recent years that when you start doing that, and you probably are you're starting off by providing administrator credentials. If you're just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe up to 10 people, it quickly gets out of hand for two reasons. First of all, you may potentially you want to grow, and if you grow all of a sudden from 10 people to, I don't know, 50, and you were probably busy.
Even 30 or even 20, it might get crazy.
Regardless of how many people it is, each additional developer with access to AWS is an exponential set of problems that you create. Imagine that administrator can do almost anything. He can add accounts to the organizations. He can remove them. He can read the bill. He can destroy stuff, provision stuff, delete his foot traps, anything. So I don't know where to put the line. 1, 2, 3 people. I think from day one, I'd go maybe not automate the entire process and the shenanigans of least privilege access. I would create at least a set of credentials. It doesn't have to be only the very limited set that I need, but at least don't put administrator, use power user access. It's an AWS permission set that gives you everything aside from IAM. As long as you don't have IAM access, you can't change your roles, because once you have IAM access, you have everything. You're basically root, regardless of who you are, because you can assume the role of the administrator.
But you just said the solution, Omer. But what happens, if all hell breaks loose? You just said the solution, root.
Mm-hmm.
So explain the solution. What happens if somebody starts getting crazy in the account? How can I get it back? Access to my account. How can I recover stuff? Maybe. How can I do that?
Okay. So you said the solution. There is a root user for any account. That's basically a user and password that created the account. Hopefully, this is not used at all, ever, unless there's a real emergency.
This is why you should use root.
Yes.
If that happens in any case.
Yes. And hopefully, once you have security systems in place, you should be alerted when the root user is actually doing something. You don't want to use it daily. Even if you're the CTO or the CEO of the company, even if it's your own private account, by the way. I have my own private account. I don't use the root credentials. I've created an IAM user. For me to be alerted when something goes wrong. It has an MFA on top of it, and it's locked. I'm not touching it. I don't know the password.
MFA? Obviously. What is MFA, Omer?
Right. Okay. That's good. That's a good question.
What is MFA?
MFA is a multi-factor authentication. Regardless of IAM, it's relevant to any security system. When you authenticate.
So what is 2FA? I heard MFA, I heard 2FA.
Same thing. It's a two-step authentication, basically.
Okay.
What it means is beyond the username and a password, add something else, because a password can be leaked. I might have sent it accidentally by a WhatsApp message or an SMS or leaked somewhere on Slack. As long as I have something that protects me beyond that, I'm kind of safe or safer than only having a password. For example, if I'm using to my Gmail account and I provided a username and a password and that password got leaked, if I've configured multi-factor authentication with my phone and the hacker or whoever got the leak is now trying to use it and they don't have my phone, they can't access my account, right? Which brings me to another set of things hopefully are done within companies.
How do you set up MFA on your phone? I mean, not which apps do you know that can do that? Like, how does it work? Can you explain maybe about like a one minute about the process of MFA, like how to configure it and then use it?
Yeah, there are a few protocols. I don't remember all of them. OTAP is the most general one. Forgot what it is. Sorry. Essentially, if you try to do it within just IAM, if you go to AWS IAM and add multi-factor authentication, you get this nice QR code that you can scan with an app on your phone. The most used one is probably Google Authenticator. You can add it as a Chrome extension that can scan it. I personally use 1Password. It's a password manager for private users.
Because of you.
Yeah, and it just fills it out on its own. You don't have to do anything. It scans the QR, it stores it, it does anything for you. And then you have this another level of protection. For us, for example, because I'm syncing Google directory to AWS, and that's the way for me to control what users can access and how they access, we enforce two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, don't call it wherever you want, on our Google users. You cannot be part of the organization if you don't have multi-factor authentication set on your user in the company. That's MFA.
Thank you for the MFA.
Yeah, of course. There's one more subject that you mentioned in this in the beginning of this episode, which I think is important to touch. You
Shoot.
spoke about other services we consume as a company, sometimes with a role. For example, maybe tomorrow I'm starting to use some kind of security service. We have probably 4 or 5 names in our head right now. And they can do one of two things. They can either tell you, okay, get me a set of credentials, get me the access ID and the secret access ID. That's probably a bad sign. That means they're not used to modern work with AWS. The better sign is when a company says, okay, this is the permission set or the IAM policy that I want to attach to a role. Give me those permissions. How do you do that? You take the policy, you attach it, you create a role, you attach a policy, and when you configure the role, you can say this role is for third-party access. Third-party access would mean that this role will be used by a different AWS account.
Trusted
Probably
entities, something like
trusted
that, I
entities,
think.
exactly. It would be an external account that can control my account using those set of permissions. Back to MFA, within that, you can add another layer that's called an external ID. That's another type of security layer on top of that. That's basically a password. So you can assume the role only if you're coming from the allowed account ID, but you need to know the password. When you provide all of these, you get a set of temporary credentials which you can use. So if that's a security service, that's what they do. They assume a role.
They have a name for that, for the external ID. You know why they, so that's like will be the last thing about the topic, and then we move to the corner, but they have a name for the confused sheriff, confused deputy, you know this type
I
of
remember
problem?
something. I can't remember. I just the name rings a bell, but I don't remember why.
The confused deputy. So in case, so I think the external ID, as you mentioned, so again, if a third-party company wants to access your AWS account and they tell you, give me IAM user credentials, they're probably not doing it right, but if they do create a user, you create an IAM user for them and grant their permission with external ID, maybe you have two AWS accounts. One is staging, one is production. And I think the confused deputy is like, you want to make sure that every time that they log in or use an account, they know which account they're using. So it's not like they're going to do production stuff in staging or staging stuff in production,
Very interesting.
We'll add it to the description.
Very
I need to
interesting.
Google it. I
Okay.
remember I read it about it. The external ID is for the confused deputy or something like that
Noted.
issue.
Noted.
Okay. Omer, 32 minutes. Oh my God, 32 minutes.
Oh
Okay,
my
so we
god. Oh
need to
my
move
god.
to the corner of the week because it's going to be almost the longest episode that we had.
We will
All
break
right, so
records as we go. Yes.
amazing. We can still talk about it more and more and more. Okay, so corner of the week. Omer, I have nothing on me because I'm still doing the same thing, so no breakthrough. Anything on your part?
Yes. Do you know what date is today?
April
You didn't
1st?
even notice, Meir. Come on.
Yeah, not funny. No, that's April Fools for thinking that I didn't notice that it's April Fool.
Exactly.
Ah?
So
Okay.
today is April 1st, and I have something for that. Um, you know who Kelsey Hightower is? You're not on
No.
Twitter, you don't know. Okay. Kelsey Hightower is this Google engineer or Google senior advocate for EK or for GKE probably on Google, but he's a really cool person to follow in the industry, talking about Golang, Kubernetes, stuff like that. Anyway, Kelsey had pushed a repo that's called No Code 6 years ago. Yeah, 6 years ago. This no code basically has nothing in it. It has an empty Docker file, an empty README, almost empty README, an empty license. It has a style guide, and it basically has nothing. And the description is, it's the best way to write secure and reliable applications. Just write nothing, deploy nowhere. Okay? So basically, the best way to do things is just not do anything. And that's how you have the best code in the world. This repo has 56,000 stars. It has been forked almost 5,000 times. It has 460 pull requests and 4,000 issues. I urge you to open the link, go to the issues if you want to laugh for an hour, or read the comments on the style guide that he pushed. It's the funniest thing on earth. People ask if it's working on Windows, why is it not compiling on Linux, they did not understand part of the examples, etc., etc. You have to read it. That's it.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Okay, I really loved it. Even I didn't even know it. Now I know it. I will read about it. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. Wow. Does it work on Linux? Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Okay, so this is for the week. For this week, we had the corner, we had everything. Omer, see you next week.
See you. Thank you for everyone who attended this meeting.
Thank you, crowd.
Thank you, crowd.
Bye,
Bye
crowd.
bye. Bye bye.